When you think about art history, most think about paintings created by Botticelli or Da Vinci. These are the type of paintings that, as the audience, we've been accustomed to seeing. When looking at these images, it is easy to see that there is an obvious absence of black figures. It is easy to see that there is an extreme disparity in the representation of white and black subjects in the paintings that compose the art historical canon of traditional academic art. Exceptions to the absence include art in which black figures were used as a foil for the beauty and appreciation of white skin, or to visually represent exoticism and the wealth of the subjects and or patrons. Similarly, the occurrence of world fairs in the US, which were public exhibitions of varying cultures, used black individuals as a source of comparison to imply blacks had still failed to advance through technology and industrialization and still were to be considered primitive. There was also a printmaking firm like Currier and Ives that produced various prints which depicted blacks in a traditional accepted stereotypical fashion. The use of the black figure as a pictorial device or symbol and to misrepresent and stereotype blacks furthered the need for an artist to create art that addressed the problem with and the absence of the black figure. It was this very need that propelled Kerry James Marshall to create a specific type of art. Kerry James Marshall, an African American artist, used black figures as the central component of his art, not to only address lack of African American representation in art, but to provide a counter story, an additional narrative that retells the story of African Americans in a new voice, a voice that counters the dominant beliefs and ideas about blacks and promotes the beauty of black identity and addresses the political and social realities of African Americans during the 20th century. Growing up in places like Birmingham, Alabama, and Watts, California, Marshall witnessed extreme racial violence of the civil rights and black power movements. Having lived through such events, Marshall gained what he considered a responsibility to depict art that was more than aesthetically pleasing, but that addressed the realities of African Americans in art and in America. Attending the Otis Art Institute, Marshall met Charles White, where he saw art that focused only on African American people for the first time. Prior to his encounter with White, Marshall had never considered the idea of race as the main subject of art, or the thought that African American artists could incorporate black culture into their artwork and still be successful. Marshall became extremely interested and dedicated to creating art that focused primarily on African Americans because he found it important for not just himself, but other African American artists and audience to see themselves in art. With this sense of social responsibility, Marshall geared his artwork to investigate and correct the invisibility of blackness and depict the tremendous disadvantage and injustice African Americans endured as they attempt to reach some type of middle class respectability. In this work of art, Marshall's quest to examine the invisibility of blacks in America is exemplified in the characteristic, extremely black figures in his artwork. It was this extreme blackness that was a visual representation of invisibility, in which Marshall believed demonstrated how being black allowed the individual to sometimes be seen and other times remain invisible. The painting itself depicts the condition of invisibility as it's related to black people in America. It is a psychological invisibility, where the presence of black people were often not wanted and was denied in the American mindset. In this artwork, modeling Manet's Olympia, Marshall moves the black figure from the margins of the painting and places her in the middle of the canvas. Unlike the Manet painting, Marshall places a spotlight upon the figure and removes the presence of the servant. It is this difference Marshall uses to continue to address the lack of black representation in arts history by forcing the audience to see the extreme blackness of the figure and make direct eye contact with the figure's gaze, a gaze that demands the audience acknowledge her presence and acknowledge that she exists. In this painting, like the previous one discussed, models after Manet's Olympia, although the figure is a man, the artwork depicts an extremely black figure in order to make up for the lack of black subject in arts history and how African Americans were considered invisible due to the color of his or her skin. Marshall's inclusion of the Pan-African flag, however, in this painting is an African nationalist symbol that became a source of African pride during the 1960s, represents his desire to show the audience African Americans were proud of being black and beauty could be found in more than just white skin. Similar to the previous paintings, Marshall used many of his other paintings to not only address invisibility in art and in America's society, but to continue this counter story that provided a new narrative that spoke to the harsh realities of African Americans during the 20th century. In the painting Many Mansions, Marshall depicts statewide gardens. Although the Edenic representation of the projects was more of a fantasy than a reality, obtaining happiness was not an impossibility for the residents of public housing. As residents of public housing, African Americans were abandoned by the government but still maintained a desire and willingness to survive and create a place for themselves in America. Marshall used this painting to continue to point out the reality that African Americans were not seen by their government and faced extreme disadvantage when trying to claim agency in America. In his painting Watts 1963, Marshall used three black children as the main subjects for the painting, where one is standing, one is kneeling, and the third child is in the fetal position. It was this work of art, along with the rest of the paintings in the series, that Marshall used to demonstrate these housing projects that were full of African Americans who led rich and complex lives and aspired to become part of the professional, political, and economic realms of America, despite having to deal and navigate through unfortunate realities of living in the projects. As an African American artist that grew up in places like Birmingham, Alabama, and Watts, California, Kerry James Marshall understood the grave importance of creating art that depicted the African American realities of the 20th century. Marshall strived to create art that responded to social and political injustices African Americans face. Marshall understood the importance of depicting black figures to deal with beauty and pride in black identity and black invisibility. It is Marshall's goal and motivation to take the black figure from the sidelines and place it at the center of the work. Marshall acknowledges the canon of great works of art consists of works that were created by non-black artists and contain almost no black figures, ultimately driving Marshall's desire to have his work in museums. So when people start examining contemporary art for greatness, he wants his artwork to be considered. He wants the artwork of African Americans to matter. Marshall uses his work to demonstrate his desire to have the black individual go down in history. He wants his depiction of black figures to mean as much as works which value and idolize the white figure.